Hi, this is John Quinlan, and welcome to Forward Forum. This edition of our show, we're going to be speaking with Callen Harty. Callen is a dear friend and someone who's written an amazing book with transformative possibilities for the world. It's called Empty Playground, a survivor's story. And in this book, Callen talks about his experience with childhood sexual abuse. He goes through in detail talking about the nature of that experience, but also the ways in which his life has been transformed in coming into a place of healing, coming into a place of illuminating the things out of the darkness, and in many ways some important lessons. For those of you who are at home who are watching with children, I'll probably advise you that this may not be appropriate for younger children, but there are, again, important lessons about the universality of this experience that affects so many people, that is unfortunately a reality in our society, but one which again is coming into the light, and which we hope in discussing these things today, it's something that will help people to a place of healing, to a better place. Hey, Callen, welcome to Forward Forum.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
Let's just mention, I want to go quickly into a passage that I think kind of loops around and talks about where you've come as we go into this, just to do this. But we should just mention a few basic facts about this subject. This isn't something, I think, as you discover throughout your life, that's an uncommon experience. So what are the statistics for women and men?
The usual statistics are 1 in 6 men are sexually assaulted before the age of 18, and 1 in 4 women. The population's about 50-50, so we're talking about 1 in 5 of every person before the age of 18.
And those statistics, of course, can't be precise because perhaps there are some folks who never do talk about it.
Most experts agree that those statistics are not even close to being precise, that there's a great likelihood that there are far, far more people who are abused as children who have never told anyone.
So, as I explained to you, I think in the arc of the interview, we like to start with this essay that's at the epilogue of the book, and that describes a little bit about where you've come. And I think in some ways, when you're talking about something that naturally has this intensity about it, it's important to talk about the transformations that can occur, the ways that you can move through a difficult experience. And should we let the essay speak for itself?
Sure.
Okay.
So we're giving away the ending this way.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. The ending is that I'm still sitting here, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a good thing.
All right.
So this was, the epilogue is a short presentation I gave at the Voices of Courage event sponsored by Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault every year, and they asked me to do the closing remarks in April of 2014. So this is the remarks that I gave that day. Today we celebrate survival. Today is about the indomitable human spirit that soars. It is not about abuse or victimhood or pain. That was yesterday. Today is about moving past hurt to a place of peace or even profound joy. Sometimes finding that place comes after a long journey over a treacherous road, travel filled with travails. It comes from releasing pain, sometimes from forgiveness for ourselves or others or both, sometimes from letting go, from sharing our stories, from therapy, from our own inner strength and beauty. But we know we can get there when we focus on honestly confronting our past, our hurt, and the things that happened to us that were beyond our control. It happens when we accept that we were not responsible for the sickness of others. It happens best when we are surrounded by love. This is a place of love. Today is a time of love. Today we gather to celebrate each other, to revel in the incredible beauty and uniqueness and gifts of all of those gathered, to thank those who have lit a candle in the darkness, who have held us up when we were falling, who have guided us along the path to recovery. We celebrate the courage and the compassion of all of those who are lifting themselves up or are helping to lift up others. It is in this courage and compassion that we become more human. Today we celebrate our humanity. We celebrate survivors and supportive allies. It is in survival that we thrive, so we celebrate thriving and living. I celebrate myself. I celebrate my survival. I celebrate you and your survival. Today, we celebrate survival. Tomorrow, we will wake up and rise up we will spread our wings and soar even higher.
Thank you very much. Beautiful evocation of this experience. And thank you for letting me do a spoiler, at the start of the program. So, I'm assuming that everybody knows who you are, but that's probably not the case.
I'm sure not.
Give a few biographical snippets. You grew up in Shullsburg, Wisconsin, in the far southwest part of the state.
Yep.
In that unglaciated area. It's kind of a unique environment unto its own.
A driftless area. It's just filled with hills and valleys. Beautiful, beautiful part of the state that not a lot of people are aware of. My ancestors settled there, as I mentioned in the book, in 1827.
27. Yeah.
So well before Wisconsin even became a state. So our family has been there for a long, long time. I left there when I went off to college at Eau Claire. Ended up moving to Platteville, then to Madison. Moved to Madison in 1982. Moved to Denver, Colorado for 4 years at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and then came back, and I've been back here since, actually in Monona, not Madison. I lived there with my partner, Brian, who this June will have been together 25 years.
June, I didn't realize.
Yeah,
Great.
and we're going to be getting married this year because we finally can legally. Other than that, I've been very, very involved in the theater community here in Madison. Had a lot of stories, poems, essays published. Was the artistic director of Broome Street Theater for a while. Co-founder and artistic director of Proud Theater, which is an LGBTQ theater group. Actually the co-founder of the 10% Society, which is UW's first ever gay group.
That's flashing back to the early 80s.
Back to the really early 80s,
Yeah.
but shortly after I moved
And you
here.
wrote for Out newspaper during that time too.
I did, yes. Which was, not everybody knows, but that's Wisconsin's first gay newspaper.
Right.
No longer exists, but it was a good paper while it lasted. So it's sort of a summary.
Yeah, no, that's good. And so many different threads here. One thing that strikes me, you're mentioning Proud Theater, and as you know, your co-founder is family to me, so Kelly Jones, and she often talks about this strand of arts and activism. And so so much of your journey in, again, in illuminating and coming to a place of healing about your story as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse is integrated into your artistic life. And art can be something that's cathartic, that's transformative, that's political. Is it in many ways all of those things in this case?
It is, for me, in every aspect of my life, it is all of those things.
Yeah.
I've always been a very political animal, always been very motivated for social causes and social justice.
So just to append to all the things you listed, you were very active at the Capitol.
Yes, I was.
During the uprising.
During the Wisconsin uprising, I was there regularly. In fact, for 2.5 years, I went after work and sang 4 verses of We Shall Overcome in the rotunda every day, and on the weekends.
And just a footnote, we talked about this, I think, last time you were on the radio with me. People would assume that a thespian and somebody who's a performer who's out in the public realm a lot, that was a relatively easy thing to do, but singing in public like that wasn't so easy.
No, singing in public and speaking in public, not necessarily easy things. I can go on stage as a character and play anybody and not have fear about that, but going as myself, presenting as myself, that's a different kind of story, a little bit scarier. And I think that's mentioned in the book as to why that might be. Well,
and it's relevant, of course, to the different evocations and different forms of theater. You beginning to talk about your experiences with childhood sexual abuse. There were several early on at Broome Street, but let's flash ahead. Again, we're doing this kind of in reverse chronological order in some ways. But there's a very powerful play that you wrote and performed several years ago. Could you tell us about that a bit?
Sure, that was in 2010. The play was called Invisible Boy. It came about after I had a life-threatening heart attack. And when that... 2008, in the mid-performance, this all happened to you, right?
It
was in the middle, opening night performance of a play that I was in.
Street,
on stage. Made the papers. Actor survives heart attack on stage. They didn't survive, the audience didn't survive my performance, but I survived the heart attack. Anyway, because of that heart attack, when you have a life-threatening event like that, whether it's experience with cancer or a heart attack or a car wreck or any of those things, I think those things tend to make you stop. It makes you process a little bit and think about what have I done with my life? What am I doing with my life? what do I have yet to do with my life? And in doing that processing, I knew that I had to deal with this issue and this story, and I had to do it artistically because that's the way I process.
Tell us a little bit about the format of the play, what modes of communication you used during the production.
Sure. It is interesting. Initially, I thought that it was going to be a dance piece because I felt that sometimes with sexual abuse that is held within our bodies, and I thought that a dance piece could express that very nicely. But when I started writing it, I realized I'm not a choreographer. I love to dance, but I wouldn't consider myself a...
And with the exception of the pirate play, I mean, musicals aren't exactly your forte either, right?
I don't like musicals. I know it's not a very gay thing to say, but I'm not a huge fan
I know, you're going to lose your credentials if you're not careful here.
Not a huge fan of musicals, but I did write a musical. I didn't write the music, my partner, Brian, did.
Right.
But that play it demanded to be a musical. That was all I could do.
Yeah.
But I decided that I couldn't choreograph this. That's not who I was. Who I grew up being is a poet and a writer. So I decided to make it a play with poetry and narrative elements. So the bulk of the play, most of the lines were by the main character. And there were several other characters surrounding him, but that poor actor probably had to memorize 75, 80% of the lines of that play. And it would go back and forth between the present and the past, and back and forth between poetry and narration and memory and sense memory. But in the end, it proved to be a pretty powerful play. People who came to see it were left moved. And on Sundays, we had talkbacks afterwards, and every Sunday, many people who stayed for the talkbacks ended up sharing their own stories of abuse and survival, in some cases never having told anyone in public prior to this. So I realized, man, this has the ability to change people's lives, to get them to face some horrible things and to deal with them.
So in relation to that, if I can get you to tell a story off of that, again, we haven't introduced this subject fully yet, but essentially the bulk of what you talk about is sexual abuse by your brother.
Yeah.
But one of the things you learned that night in the talkback session, there were two people from your hometown, and they shared a revelation that had further meaning for you.
Yeah, totally shocking to me. During one of those talkbacks, these two friends of mine from my hometown were there, and one of them casually mentioned a doctor from our home county who was reputed to have abused many young people over the years. And I realized as he was sharing that story that doctor had done things to me that were probably not part of an examination, but I didn't realize it at the time.
And probably affected countless other young people too.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, the horrible thing that he would do that in that kind of trusted position. Although the position or relationship or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's horrible that anybody would do that.
Again, it brings home that theme that this is something that's often in the shadows, perhaps secret, but it is something, if it doesn't affect you directly, it probably affects somebody that you know and love.
I think there are bound to be very few people in this world who don't know somebody who has been abused. I tell a story in the book about I was working on a play at the UW, and two of the other actors and myself ended up going out for beers after a rehearsal one night, and maybe after a few beers I somehow mentioned that I had been abused as a child, and both of them, one man, one woman, and myself, all three of us had been abused as children, and we shared that night and talked about it. And at the time, I was like, well, this is shocking that that it just happens to be two other people. Since I've written the play, since I've written the book, it's not shocking anymore.
Yeah.
I have people coming up to me all the time and saying, that happened to me too. And oftentimes, I'm the first person they've shared that with.
Again, I know we're backing into this, but we're talking about Invisible Boy, the effect of that play. One of the things I think you mentioned, about 1,400 people, this is the time of the writing of the book, had seen the video. At least one person a day, as best you can tell, is coming back to that. So it has meaning in that sense.
It's still averaging one person a day online.
It's on YouTube? Or
it's on Vimeo.
Okay.
vimeo.com,
All right.
and just look for Invisible Boy. But last week, there was one day when 10 people watched it, and another day where another 4 watched it, another day where 1 person watched it. Now, I don't have any way to know if they watched through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Maybe some people are not able to. I will give a warning if anybody does decide that they want to check that out. There's a trigger warning to that. There are some moments that could be triggering. So just, plead with people to take care of themselves first.
So, and perhaps we should address that for someone who's watching this show. That could you explain what a trigger is and what that would mean for somebody?
Yeah, a trigger is anything that can throw you back into that horrible space where these things were happening. It can make you think about it and become frightened, or all sorts of different reactions can happen from it. So even for some people, even just hearing a word like rape can trigger a memory in them that throws them off. So you want to be careful when you talk about these things. And I usually tried, when we did the play, we had representatives from Rape Crisis Center, Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and Men Stopping Rape at the play in the audience with brochures and information available. We had counselors available. So if anybody, even listening to this,
Right.
feels they need help, I would hope they would contact.
So those would all be resources,
Yeah.
an immediate resource that we often use when we're dealing with a subject like suicide or other
Right.
things that have a profound effect on someone, is to call the Dream Mental Health Center, their crisis line.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, that's readily available if you Google it online.
Right.
An operator could probably hook you up too. So with Invisible Boy, again, it's gotten out into the world in all these multiple ways. So it was performed in, was it San Antonio?
Yeah, I got an email out of the blue from a young woman at the San Antonio High School of the Arts who had watched it online.
Sort of like this show on Fame. It's in New York.
Sort of, yeah, that kind of high school.
Okay, yeah.
And she wanted to do the play as her senior project at the high school for the performing arts. Because it was a high school, we went back and forth over some editing choices because the initial play had some fairly raw stuff in there. So we came to some agreements on those things, and they performed it as her senior project. I got to go down and see it. It was really nice.
Was there any kind of a talkback or any kind of reaction similar to when you produced the play here?
They did not do talkbacks, or at least I was only there for one performance, so they may have on other performances. But
is it the hope that the play might get further out into the world at some point? Or?
I would love to see that happen. I think it's a very powerful play. I've written 23 plays, and I think The Invisible Boy is definitely my most important. And I think, if not the best, one of my best plays. I feel like it deserves to be seen more, and I think people would get good out of seeing it, out of it being performed elsewhere.
So let's go a little bit into the story and some of the choices that you made as you were writing the book. Because it's only natural that I think the book obviously goes into a level of detail that we won't go into here. But I was telling you, I had another author on recently, Rob Gard, who writes about very vulnerable places, including his own experience with molestation when he was a child, and how that had a further ripple effect on his life. I was just curious to, when you make a choice like that, I mean, you would think, on the surface, when you write a book, it's really all about putting your best face forward, and why do you go to a vulnerable place? Why do you take the risks that someone might judge you? How did you make those choices?
For me, it was one simple choice. I needed the book to be honest, completely honest. And if that meant describing some of the horrible things that I did as a young person, that was fine. It also meant describing in some detail, though not completely, some of the horrible things that happened to me. And I felt that was important because I really believe that it's too easy to dismiss someone when they say I was abused, whether it's as a child or an adult. And it's not necessarily that people want to dismiss somebody, it's that they don't want to think about it.
Yeah.
So if you say I was abused as a child, it's easiest to think of the least possible thing that could mean. So I felt it was important to describe in some detail some of the things that happened to me, so that people couldn't do that. That they couldn't just say, it probably was nothing.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned is it's been in the news, and I'm trying to think of the context, but occasionally something does come up where a child, for various reasons, will mention allegations of sexual abuse. It turns out that they're not real, or I'm thinking back to the Rape Crisis Center and our friend Kelly Anderson, this case that played itself out with Patty about 10 to 12 years ago. She was accused of falsifying, allegations of a rape. Now, it turned out not to be the case, and there were lots of other reasons. But anyway, there's this pervasive notion out there that somehow this is over-reported, or that ideas are planted in a young child's mind to make them think something happened that really didn't. How do you put all that in perspective?
Studies have shown that more than 95% of children who report that they were sexually assaulted or abused are telling the truth. Mm-hmm. In the rare instances when they are not, it is almost always the case where there's a divorce happening and one of the parents is setting the child against the other.
So it's a warning sign in that case of some trauma that the child's going through. So it's something
either
you should
way,
respond to.
Yeah. So, but in the vast majority of cases, if a child says that these things are happening, they should be believed, and it should be investigated, and things should be done.
I'm not sure whether you'll hear or not, but anecdotally, I think I have several friends that seem to have been pretty profoundly affected by an experience with childhood sexual abuse. Later in life, they move into a place of denial and say that it didn't happen, including a friend who was a multiple personality. There was dissociation, there were other things, and I just don't think that's could be happening. But I mean, the profound nature of this, I guess this whole concept of dissociation, which I don't think you experience as much. I think you do have, it sounds like, really clear memories of things. But it's only a natural thing that on some level we protect ourselves by denying what had happened, by compartmentalizing it. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate on that and kind of how it played out in your own life?
Yeah, I denied what happened sort of on one level for a long time. I didn't admit to myself what was going on. It took me a long time to face what was going on and to deal with it. So I wasn't really denying it. I'd had those specific memories that you mentioned, but I wasn't dealing with the issue. There are people, though, who just don't recognize that anything happened at all.
Yeah.
Those the repressed memories that you've heard about, where these things happened and their body, as a way of protecting them, blocks it all out, and then they end up recovering those memories later in life. I had the situation where I didn't remember all the details of everything that happened to me, but many instances there were some really specific pictures and images and feelings that always were there, that I knew had happened. But I think one of the things that happens with people is because of the nature of our society not wanting to admit that this is real, mm-hmm. I think oftentimes people second guess themselves. Yeah. I've done that myself. And I mentioned in the book, when I wrote the play, somebody I know called me and asked about it, and I told them it was based on real occurrences when I was a kid, and they blurted out, "Was it Kevin? He did that to me too," which was horrifying.
This is Kevin, your brother?
Yes, yeah. It was horrifying and a relief at the same time.
Yeah. It
was horrifying to know that there was somebody else that he had done this to, but it was also a relief because any of those thoughts that I had about maybe this really didn't happen, maybe I'm, imagining this, he described pretty much the same things as my experiences. And so that sort of solidified that was true.
Again, to make this accessible and on some level safe for our audience, we may be speaking more metaphorically or other things, but hey, as an artist and as a playwright, you often speak in those ways. But I guess what struck me is I think the notion of this coming out of the darkness, or in some ways, in a very literal way, mm-hmm. the incidents happening in a closet, in a dark place, and again, how bringing that into the light was really important. But in the case of your assault by your brother Kevin, it occurred. I guess there's a number of dynamics to explore here, but there's a myth that this is somehow a sexual act, but really it's perhaps more of an act of power and control. Does that make sense?
Power, control, and violence, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
It's often misconstrued as a sexual act because it deals with private parts. But it's really not about that. It's really about his pleasure and his control and what he wants, not what I wanted.
And we're obviously talking about this. There's a new dimension to this, I think, in terms of our beginning to understand and to discuss how this affects men. And then, of course, the extra dimension that you face as a gay man. Why don't we take men first? Again, it's not that it's easy to discuss, or it's gotten the attention that it deserves for women. But there's an extra dimension to being a man in our society, and having this experience as part of your experience.
Yeah, there are. Well, first of all, there's not a lot of men willing to talk about this.
Right.
That's happening more and more. There's organizations out there like Male Survivor and 1 in 6 that are designed specifically for men to deal with this issue. But historically, men have not been comfortable opening up and talking about this. It's one of the reasons back in 2010 I wanted to write Invisible Boy, because there wasn't anything out there that I could see. When I was writing it, I was doing some research. I went to one of the bookstores in town, and there was huge, absolutely huge bookstore, and there was one bookshelf with books about sexual assault and abuse and that kind of thing. And down here there was half of a shelf dealing with men, and out of that half a shelf, almost all of them were therapeutic books by therapists or psychologists, and a couple of those included stories from men, which was what I turned to immediately, and then there might have been 1 or 2 books by men about their own assault. And I think it's important to tell our own stories. I think that, when I was coming out as gay, when I went to do research on that, and I wanted to explore that, because I'm a reader and a writer, I went to the library. And what I wanted was not books by psychologists dissecting why I was gay or what it meant. What I wanted was...
be like David Rubin and everything you've always wanted about sex. That was horrible.
Horrible. In fact, that set me back about 5 years.
Yeah, me too.
I'd like to do a class action suit against that guy.
Yes.
But what I looked for was books by gay men in their coming out stories.
Yeah.
Telling you, this is how I felt, this is what I went through. And so the same when I was, doing the research on this play, I wanted to see other people's stories as well. And I found that there really weren't a lot. So after, a couple years after the play was done, I realized I'm not done telling this story yet. That's why I need to write the book.
So I want to parse out, again, your gay identity, your experience of this, separate it out, not conflate the two. We'll do that in a minute, but just to come back to, again, I think the dynamic of being a man, to come back to how a perpetrator, someone in this case like your brother Kevin, is able to exert control. In part, it's the shame that comes with a man who's experienced this and their compulsion to protect themselves by telling you got to keep a secret, because if you got this out, God, the way that people would think about you, as a man and everything else, it's a source of shame that has a special connotation when you're a guy. And then it's tinged with this touch of homophobia.
I was just going to say there's also homophobia involved there, whether it's just regular homophobia or internalized homophobia.
Right.
For those who are gay. Men aren't supposed to cry. Men aren't supposed to have feelings. Men are supposed to be strong. So if somebody attacks you in whatever way, whether it's with their fists on the playground, you're supposed to fight back. And if you lose that fight, or you don't fight at all, then there is shame in that, because our culture says that's not the way men are supposed to be. So there are levels for men that are different, I think, than for women.
And again, while we're dealing in isolation with men who face this, have you found that men who are heterosexual, who've seen your play, who've read your book, can also identify with it?
Yeah, I have found that. And I've also found that women have been able to identify with it. Actually, a lot of the people who have read it so far that I've heard from have been women. In a couple of cases, I got emails from people saying, I'm a woman, but I totally identified with what you were describing here. I think there's a lot of universality with being a survivor, whether it's male or female. And not to say that women don't face shame either when these things happen to them, but it's a little bit different for men just because of our societal expectations.
And so,
which, by the way, I think are ridiculous.
Right.
But that's a whole nother story.
Okay. Another hour we'll have you on to explore that in full. But I think one of the points that you make is to separate out sexual orientation, a gay identity, in this case, from the incidence of all of this. First of all, I think you make the point, while I think sexual assault is predominantly, probably statistically maybe committed more by a heterosexual man, ironically.
Yes.
It can manifest in all kinds of different ways. And I know through your work that you did when you were on staff at Outreach and working with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Rape Crisis Center and other organizations, we're to again bring out the shadows to say it's not a negative. Because I think there's a certain sense that folks in the gay community, especially as we were in this tentative place, we didn't want to discuss something like a man assaulting another man.
No, because that's the myth, that's the stereotype that's been out there, is that homosexuals are going to be predators against your children, and children are victims a lot, but it's not necessarily homosexual men.
But just again, the demographics of this, you mentioned in the book that a woman can assault another woman, or an older woman. This myth of an older woman taking a young man through the sexual rite of passage. Unfortunately, that's held up in a way that's really not legitimate, because for that young man, he's not ready for that.
No, he's not. And if you do research on it and you read some of the stories of adult men who were abused by women as children, by older women, it's no easier for them than it has been for me or anybody else. There's that myth out there about, you got your lessons, right. Good for you. That's not what that child is feeling. It can be really devastating and damaging.
So even though on the face of it, society's pretty unanimous that that's a bad thing, that certainly sex with a minor is a bad thing, that all this other stuff, on the other hand, we're incredibly screwed up about talking about it, acknowledging it, about putting sexuality in its place, or about the pervasiveness of sexual imagery and advertising, sexualizing, say, a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old girl in a beauty pageant, or all these other things. We really have to realize kids need to be protected, and things have to happen in developmentally appropriate ways. And it's not that we should grow kids up or raise kids in a way that makes them feel ashamed of their sexuality. On the other hand, we have to protect them, put it in the right perspective.
Yeah, there's a law that has been passed in 26 states called Arisen's law that had never been introduced in 7 states. Wisconsin was one of them. Was just introduced this past session. I don't know where it's at right now. I'm waiting to hear from a legislator friend of mine as to if and when there's going to be a hearing. She's been trying to schedule one. But what that law does is it requires schools to provide education to young children about good and bad touch and that kind of thing, so that they know when something is wrong and how to report it. It also, coincidentally with that, also teaches parents about some of the signs that they might see and some of the things that they can do as well. I'm hoping that it passes. Over half the states already have. There's no reason that should not be a bipartisan bill that gets through the legislature.
I mean, you talked about growing up in the 60s too. It was a fairly repressed time. You were in a small town, a very Catholic family. And at some point you did approach your mother about what was going on. It was very hard for her to grasp or to know what to do. I mean, in many ways, I think a lot of sexual abuse survivors just report feeling so let down and so disappointed in a parent's reaction.
Right. I try to keep in mind that it was a different era, where there wasn't as much information as we have now, where there were not television shows about sex. In fact, when I watched Johnny Carson at night, my mother would say, "That's a little raw, isn't it?" And you compare that now to what's on TV. People did not talk about these issues openly back then. She was a single mother. My father died when I was 2 of a heart attack. I don't think she had the skills or the knowledge to know how to deal with it, but her response was still damaging. And it wasn't intentional. She didn't try to hurt me. But when I told her, her response was, "Oh, you shouldn't let him do that to you."
Now explain the subtle distinction about why that's the wrong way to look at it.
Right, because that puts the onus on me.
Right.
I shouldn't let him do that to me. She could have said, "Oh, he should not do that to you." And then she could have talked to him. And she may have, but if she did, she didn't tell me or, elaborate any further. That was it. No more was discussed after that. And I know she did her best, to handle it. But her best, I think, would be better these days.
And some of this is speculation, but you do wonder in her case, and I think you discovered in your brother's case, that very often this is a pattern that repeats itself. Now, it's important, again, to make the distinction within that. There is a widespread belief that once someone has been sexually assaulted, that they will become a perpetrator themselves. And that's not the case at all.
That's, you shouldn't say not at all, because
rather,
it does happen. But it is not, there's no destiny to that.
There's no destiny, right.
Yeah, it's, in fact, most people who are abused do not go on to abuse others.
But again, just to give people a sense, and perhaps this is gives them a chance to examine within their own family dynamics or situation that they may be worried about. It can get complicated because there is a deeper history here. If one person's been abused and is struggling with it, it makes them less able perhaps to be able to address it. So I mean, it does need to be examined. It does need to be brought out of the shadows and talked about in that sense.
I think if you have somebody who was abused as a child, whose child then comes to them and tells them that, and this person has not dealt with it, they're not going to be able to help their child deal with it. I just think that seems to be a logical assumption. Now, there may be some cases where they can, but I think for the most part, if this person hasn't dealt with it, the older person, and something happens to their child, in some cases it may take them back. It may actually hurt them as well and take them back into their own pain that maybe they've blocked out for a while. But I think it's going to be difficult for them to deal with that child's issue. Hopefully they can in some way, but I think it's really important that we all deal with these issues.
So again, recognizing some of the societal myths that we have. I mean, 30 years ago when you and I were doing activism, writing for our newspaper, one of the big advocacy projects was to convince big brothers and big sisters to accept gay and lesbian volunteers. The biggest barrier to that were molestation myths, that somehow placing gay or lesbian people, in relationship with kids, in a big brother, big sister relationship, is going to place the kids in danger.
Right.
So that's one thing that's got to get out of the way here. I mean, in fact, as we've discovered, and as was affirmed in that Supreme Court decision last year, gay and lesbian people can be remarkable parents and big brothers and big sisters and uncles and aunts and everything else. It was such a loss to so many children who needed someone like that in their lives when we conflated those two things.
Right, absolutely. I think big brothers, big sisters, they need to be careful about who they bring on.
Right.
It doesn't
let it cross all lines of sexual orientation.
Exactly. It doesn't matter what the orientation is. I have a straight woman who's volunteering, I have a gay man who's volunteering, it doesn't matter. You need to check the background of those people and make sure that, do everything you can to make sure that they're a good fit.
So while these are two separate issues, I think as you write about it, I think for the gay man who experiences childhood sexual abuse, and this is true of a number of my friends, as you think back to when you had an awareness of being gay, the fact that it's a man-on-man act can make things very confusing. And you wonder, did this make me gay? Did it, anyway, how did you sort all that through?
I think most gay men who are assaulted like that have that very question in their heads.
Right.
Did this make me gay? Or the question, did this happen to me because I'm gay? And he somehow sensed that.
Right.
And I think those are natural questions to come up. I mean, it sort of seems to happen. For myself, and I think most gay people would figure this out for themselves too if they process well enough, I ended up figuring out that several years before the first time anything happened to me, assault-wise, I had a crush on a second grade boy. When I was in
In my
Sec-
case, it was Stephen, but yeah,
Yeah.
I understand exactly.
I was in second grade, he was in first, actually. And I realized, in coming out and in processing all those emotions, I realized that I had these crushes and things
Yeah.
and likes all along. And it wasn't sexual. One of the things that drives me nuts about, as far as the gay identity goes, it's not just sexual.
Right.
We have emotional preferences, physical, sexual, spiritual. We have a lot of different preferences. And, so that crush in second grade wasn't about sex. I didn't know what sex was. It was about, I thought he was cute.
Yeah.
So.
It's about breaking out of gender boxes. Again, with my best friend Stephen, we would participate with the girls in all kinds of these theater things. We would let them dress us up for mock weddings and go on parades and do things other guys, you aren't supposed to do. You're supposed to be all about sports, and you're not supposed to zip your coats together like I did with Stephen on the playground, or do other things that indicate that you're breaking out of boxes, and you're just saying, if I want to be close to my best male friend, I can be.
Yeah.
But that really has little to do with sex.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think it is natural to have those questions.
Right.
Because of the events that happen.
So yeah, I mean, you're alluding to this, but again, sexual orientation is just a more fundamental part of who we are, and it's again the stereotypes that we have, or a weak father, strong mother, or all these other things that supposedly influence. And intuitively it doesn't make sense, because people who grow up in the same families, turn out to be of different sexual orientations, and
right.
Yeah, and the same thing here. There's not cause and effect. But as you've alluded to, it makes it more complicated.
That issue is going to be in my next book, by the way.
There we go.
So, which I'm like 230 pages into so far.
And your brother Kevin, was in his teens at the time, roughly 6 years older.
Yes.
And you were preteen, say ages 8 or 9 or 10 or thereabouts, or.
I was 10 when the bulk of the abuse started. There was an incident maybe a year before where I was sort of groped through my pants.
And this was ongoing, continued throughout his early adulthood, through a marriage, through other things. Again, just to bring this full circle, he eventually did come out as gay.
Yes.
And that must have been kind of a throw you off, or what did that mean? I guess was that within all of this creating confusion about how to separate those things out?
Maybe a little bit. I think it's sort of farther. I think it's sort of sensed.
Okay.
Before he came out to me, I came out I was the youngest in our family and the first one to come out.
So I want to just introduce this first, so we make sure we get it before the end of the hour. But the other part of this, and please feel free to explore in greater detail some of what you encountered, in terms of the abuse that Kevin instituted upon you. But yeah, I think anyway, it's an interesting choice that you made. I think some folks want to confront, understandably have anger, in some ways want to seek, for lack of a better description, revenge, or make the person pay for it. But you very quickly, at some point, embarked on wanting to be on a path of forgiveness. What brought you there, and where did that go?
I think part of it was being raised in that Irish Catholic family.
Okay.
That my mom always said, once a Catholic, always a Catholic. Though I don't practice that religion anymore, I think the morals and the ethics that I grew up with were instilled in me pretty deeply. And so, one of the things the Catholic Church teaches is forgiveness. So that's sort of always been there. The other thing I realized is that holding on to anger and holding on to hatred is much more damaging to the person holding it than the person it's projected toward. They don't necessarily feel that at all.
Yeah.
They don't know that you hate them. They don't know that you're angry, or they might, but they don't care. It eats inside. It eats you from the inside. And unless you find a way to let that go, it can destroy you, not the other person. So I felt that was really important. And I also have to specify, that doesn't work for everyone.
Right.
Some people need to hold on to that anger for whatever reason.
Well, and there has to be accountability, and there has to be the person acknowledging what happened to a certain extent to make it real, I guess, too, right?
Yeah, that hasn't happened in my case.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that I can't let it go still.
Okay. So you describe it in a later chapter of the book. And essentially, you found yourselves both kids again. Yes, I did apologize. No, I didn't apologize. So,
Yeah.
from the perspective of the perpetrator, they may think somehow they were accountable or that they apologized, but that's a very different perspective than the one you have.
Yeah. Because I was writing this book, I felt morally that it was important to talk to Kevin and let him know this was going to be published, because he was living in my hometown still,
Yeah.
and it could impact his life because it's a small town, people talk. So I felt it was important and the moral thing to do to let him know that this was going to be coming out. So I went and had a talk with him, and it was obviously not an easy thing to do. We had never really talked about it in any kind of detail, and I pretty much just told him, I need to talk to you, and I don't want you to talk back. I want you to listen. And I told him that he hurt me very badly as a child, and that I let him know that I was writing this book, and that I felt that it was important that he know that.
So as people understand the importance, because control is a lot of this, and it's a negative kind of control that the perpetrator is extending upon you. But in some ways, in confronting the person or in dealing with it, you have a chance to seize back that control. Now, in this case, the conversation happened in your house, and as best you could tell, the only place to have the conversation was in the very basement in which the abuse had occurred.
Yeah, it happened in the house that I grew up in.
But
yeah.
How did that all translate into it? What did that mean to you in that moment, to be able to tell him, to have the courage and the strength not to sink, essentially to travel back and be the little boy who was experiencing this stuff again, but to be the adult who was confronting all of this?
It was very difficult, and in fact, I sat down and he stood, towering over me in a position of power and control. But that was just, symbolically physical. The words that I had to say were where the real power was at. I did feel incredibly empowered. I felt that I took control back of the whole situation. I let him know that it was not right, that it hurt deeply, that it was not acceptable. And then I let him know, I'm going to be putting this book out, and I want you to know it. And then at that point, he said, well, that's going to hurt me, so you're trying to get even with me. And really, it wasn't about getting even with him. I was actually trying to be honest with him and let him know that this was coming so that he could prepare however he needed to.
Again, we're about a 10-minute warning, so just if you have things that you want to interject. But I think, again, a large part of the arc of your book, I don't know if this has meaning for you, but I mean, to a certain extent, I think as we write a book, we are thinking the what ifs. So, part of your goal, of course, is that someone who goes through this can come to a place of healing perhaps before the time you did. It was relatively late, in your recent life that you've had a chance to do that. But because of that, there were struggles with alcoholism, probably your sexuality and your sexual activity played out in a way that were different than they would have had this not been an issue. Could you explain some of that?
Sure. I made a lot of unhealthy choices, and a lot of it was because I wasn't dealing with the real internal issue. I drank heavily, very heavily, for over a decade, a little over a decade, before I woke up one day and realized this is going to kill me if I don't stop. And it wasn't until I did that, that's what sort of helped propel me toward where I am now. But drugs as well, sexual promiscuity, there's a whole sort of laundry list of things that sexual survivors tend to do as adults.
Yeah.
Child sex abuse survivors tend to do as adults that are unhealthy. And I pretty much did every single one of those as an adult without recognizing that was why. Those abuse has effects on you that you're not even aware of. I didn't realize until I was writing Invisible Boy and doing some of the reading that I was doing that I had made conscious choices for years whenever I went into a restaurant or a space like that where I sat in a corner where I could see everything. And apparently that I'm not the only one who ends up making that kind of choice. And I didn't realize. I still do it. I feel safer that way, and I think that's okay. But I now recognize why I'm doing it, and I find that interesting.
So with those choices you make that you say, that you're sharing are in some ways are very commonplace among other people who've experienced sexual abuse. I would imagine that when you are at a conference like the ones you've helped plan in Madison or the ones you've gone to speak at with other childhood sexual abuse survivors around the country, there must be something very cathartic in running across someone who says something that, gosh, I did that too. And destigmatizing about it, liberating to learn that that's that, and to separate it out from who you are at the core and what the symptoms are of having experienced this.
Right. And I think there ends up being community in that.
Yeah.
And I think whenever you have community, whatever particular group you might be in, that community really helps you be comfortable with yourself.
So, not to go too deep here, not that we haven't already, but there's a dichotomy here that I sense in the book. Is as you describe your coming out of your struggle with alcoholism, 12-step programs weren't necessarily for you. In some ways, you describe this as being kind of an individual struggle. And yet, in the case of what you're describing now, it was a place of community support to come to grips with the experience of sexual abuse. So why were the different choices made in different cases here?
I've referred a lot of people to AA,
Okay.
believe it or not, even though I've never gone to AA myself, because I've seen a lot of people healed from severe alcohol abuse and other issues through AA or NA. I've seen it be very good for many people. I'm a very stubborn Irishman.
Comes back to that stubborn Irish stuff again.
It does. I did not want to join an organization that told me what I had to believe.
Mm.
I also wanted to claim...
You were saying you had a belief in a higher power and some of the things that are
very much.
embodied in the AA approach, but you didn't want to be told how to believe it.
Exactly,
Right.
that I had to believe that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't for me because of that. So I decided, for me, it was very important to claim my own failures and my own successes. What I've done with my life, whether it's failure or success, is on me. I'll accept it, good or bad. Didn't mean to slam the mic there.
That's all right. So, again, one of the themes that's in the book is at different points in your life, revealing different aspects of this. I think there was a relative early on, just the fact of the sexual abuse. And then later, having people you could talk to, a partner out in Denver who you talked to about more of the nature of what had happened. In an arc to talking with your sister Colleen, talking with your partner of 25 years now, Brian, about it. Could you explain what that arc was and what kind of every step along the way meant to you to be able to share of that?
Sure. One of the things in that list of things that survivors have a tendency to do is not trust, because trust has been violated. So
and trust can be violated sometimes in revealing this because we're not especially comfortable about it.
Absolutely. I fortunately had a lot of good people in my life who I was able to share it with without any horrible repercussions. There are people who, their families will kick them out when they say, I was abused by this relative. No, you weren't. Get out of here. Just horrible kind of things. So I was very fortunate in that many of the people that I ultimately shared with were very understanding and supportive. But I also gauged how trustworthy those people were step by step along the way. So for me, and again, this harkens back to my coming out too, the process that I have when it comes to these kinds of things is very slow. I internally examine things, I do research, I come to conclusions, then I test it by sharing with some very close trusted person. That's what I did when I came out as gay, is what I did when I came out as a survivor, and then trust little by little more and more people. And then once I get to a point where I'm comfortable with this is what happened, this is who I am, then I'm just open. I'm an open book.
So in our final 4 minutes, I guess you relate this specifically to Brian, to your life partner, soon to be your husband. In some ways, it was one of the things maybe that brought you together, that there was a comfortableness about this. I'm sure it was on a larger spectrum of all of the ways in which you clicked, in which he got you and understood you. Does that make sense on some level?
It does. When you have somebody who's that supportive. When you're, first of all, when you're already in love with somebody, and then they are that supportive of what is typically a shameful secret, and they're loving and understanding about that. I describe in the play, in Invisible Boy, this is somebody who would hold me when I needed holding, who would step away when I needed him to step away, who was really in tune to those kinds of things. That's priceless.
So in our final few minutes, this is something I think we all fantasize about. If you had something to say to that young man in his teens or early 20s who was grappling with this, or this is perhaps relevant to other people of that age group now that are dealing with this, what messages would you impart to them?
I think the most important is, it is not your fault. It is not your responsibility. What happened to you was someone else doing something to you. It wasn't anything you did. So you are not the one to blame for this happening, because that is another one of the things that we tend to do, is blame ourselves. There's a lot of self-blame, self-shame, self-hatred, and it shouldn't be that. And it's hard to accept that it shouldn't be that. We tend to go there. And so if there's anything that people could get out of this, it's that it's not your fault. You did not do this to yourself. You did not deserve this.
So as an activist, you've seen movements where the arc does bend toward justice. It certainly have happened with the LGBT community, although we're not there yet. I would imagine there are parallels here. Do you see progress being made? Do you see perhaps a day when this can come into the light in a way that other kids won't experience what you experience?
I do. It is moving that way, slowly. I mean, there are laws like Aaron's Law, the Child Victims Act. There are laws being passed, regularly that do more to protect children than we have in the past. There is public discussion. Oprah did a show several years ago with 100 different male survivors on that show. It was powerful, incredibly powerful. Well, millions of people saw that. So millions of people, out of those millions of people, 600,000 men may have said, this is me too. I need to deal with this. I need to do something. I need to talk about it. So we're getting there, but it's a long, long ways to go yet.
So Jeff, if we could bring the slide up again with the book cover. Again, it's Empty Playground. It's a survivor story by Callen Harty. Just as we close out, obviously there is power in the telling of our stories. Is this something you encourage other people to consider? Maybe it's an individual choice, but you see that power.
There is, but it really does have to be an individual choice, because for some people it may not be safe. So I think people really need to examine where they're at,
who they share this with,
who they share it with, how they share it, and to make sure they're safe sharing it before they do. Me, I'm one of those people who I'm just out and open about my life.
As we close out, let's just mention some of those several organizations that sponsored some of the conferences you've been part of, places where people can go for help.
Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, I work on their all committee, and they helped sponsor the conference that I started called Paths to Healing.
That's coming up again?
June 30th, I believe is the date. I should have had that in my mind.
That's all right.
Rape Crisis Center has a crisis line that you can call. Men Stopping Rape has done a lot of work. Outreach is a place to turn if you're gay or lesbian and you have any kind of issue, including this. There's malesurvivor.org, 1in6.org. Those are both for male survivors. There's also RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest Survivors Network. There's several organizations out there. Do a search online. You can find many.
So the point is, isolation doesn't happen. It doesn't have to happen. There is help.
There is definitely.
And in supportive community.
Definitely help and hope.
All right. Callen Harty, thank you so much for a very rich, enlightening hour, and thanks for all the good work you do in the world.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. This has been Forward Forum. Here at the studios of the Sun Prairie Media Center. We appreciate, as always, the help, and we also appreciate the generous support of the EVU Foundation. On behalf of our work, I'm John Quinlan. Have a great week.